David Wilderness. My in-game persona is Caelan Clearwaters. I'm out of Caradoc. So for those of you that don't know me, I've been a home brewer for going on 15 years now, since a little before I was supposed to be doing it. And I like to think that I've gotten fairly decent at it, and I'm also an engineer by trade with a chemistry background, and so I get really into the science of what's happening when we home brew, and that's really helped me get to, I think, a better level and be more consistent in my home brewing. We're going to be making a pretty basic sweet cider today, and this is something that you guys can all try at home. I'll talk a little bit about where to get some of the ingredients, where you can and can't cut corners, and you know, how to get the best possible cider for your buck, because it's cider season. So starting out, saying step one is sanitization. People have been making alcohol for a really, really long time in really, really dirty, medieval, Black Plague infested conditions. So the odds of you managing to brew something that's going to make you anything worse than a little bit of a tummy ache is pretty darn slim. You're not going to kill yourself doing this at home, I trust. But that said, everything that makes it to our brew is going to affect the taste. Every little microorganism in there is going to eat stuff and is going to exude byproducts. Everything that goes in there is going to poop in your cider. And if its poop doesn't taste good, we don't want it in there. So we really want to sanitize well to make sure we've got the best possible control over what makes it into our cider. So there's a couple of different clean products that you can use. The most common you'll see is Star Sand. This is a chemical cleaner. It's really common in restaurants and places like that where you just want to clean everything and kill everything dead. The thing with Star Sand is you have to be really sure that you rinse off very well before any of these tools are introduced back into your brewing process. And especially if you're on well water or something like that, rinsing it off might just reintroduce microbes anyways. So what I like to use is called One Step. It's an oxygen-based cleaner, and you don't have to rinse after you use it. Because it uses oxygen and not harsh chemicals, it's not going to hurt anything when it gets into your brew, and it doesn't really affect the taste. The other option, if you're a serious hippie or just happen to have a lot of it around, is of course white vinegar. You want to use about 8 tablespoons per gallon at least concentration to make sure you kill everything that's on your surfaces. And so what I've done in advance for today is I've sanitized all of the tools and everything I'm going to be using, because watching me clean is kind of boring. So let's go ahead and get started with the actual process. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to pitch our yeast. Yeast comes in little packets, and if you excuse me for half a second, I'm going to grab one to show you.
Just not under there the second season. Oh, I'm still on. Holy shit.
So yeast comes generally in these little packets. You can buy it in bulk. It's usually labeled. It comes a bunch of different types. You can order it on Amazon or at your local brew store. You can even use baker's yeast, but these yeasts have been specially cultured and designed to give you the best possible flavor. The two most common for cider are called EC1118 or D47. We're going to use D47 today. For those interested, it's derived from an Old English-style cider yeast. And so what we're going to do is we're going to pitch it. Because we're using cider, cider has a fair bit of sugar in it. So all I've done is poured the contents of that yeast packet into this cleaned jar here. I'm going to pour half a glass worth of cider here. Grab my sanitized little spoon from back here. Give it a decent little stir. And get it all kind of broken up and dissolved in there. This is actually, so these little packets are generally designed to do about 6 gallons of yeast, or of alcohol. So when you're doing just 1 gallon batches at a time, like I said, these only cost $1, so don't worry too much about wasting a little bit of yeast. That's not going to be your biggest loss if you mess up. But the thing is when you're doing bigger batches, we often use things called yeast energizer or yeast nutrient. And these are a couple of little chemicals you can get at your homebrew store. They're entirely optional. And basically what they do is they speed up the yeast's metabolism and let the yeast digest faster. So yeast goes through first a stage where it replicates a lot, and it builds up a whole big colony of yeast in our brew. Because we've put what basically amounts to too much yeast in, we're not going to use those today. Using the extra yeast will serve the same purpose. So we're going to set this aside now that it's got some sugars, and we'll come back to that in a little bit, and hopefully it'll be nice and bubbly. I happen to know this will be nice and bubbly because I just got these yeast packets the other day, so I know they're fresh. Especially when you've had them in your fridge for a longer period of time, that's when you really want to proof the yeast and make sure that it's really good. Give that one more little stir and make sure it's nice and dissolved. All right, then we're going to come over here. So the first significant piece of equipment is a big glass jug. You can do it in plastic. The standard airlocks and stuff that we'll get to in a second in terms of equipment work just fine and fit into your regular gallon jugs. You can get one of these that's reusable for $3 or $4 at any homebrew store or anywhere else that sells bottles and things like that. Or you can just, for the first time, buy a really nice gallon of cider, and a lot of those come in these glass bottles too. They're nice to have because they're reusable. So, cider itself has a fair amount of sugar. Sugar is what yeast eats and turns into alcohol. That's its second digestive phase after it's reached a saturation and reproduced a lot. So, the thing is it doesn't have a ton of sugar, though. If you look at the side, you'll notice it only has about 30 grams per serving. We want more than that, because on its own, just regular apple cider is only going to let you reach about 2 or 2.5% alcohol. So we're going to fortify that with some extra sugars, because we want to get up into that nice, strong potency of at least 5.5 or 6%. Some of these will run up closer to 9 or 10%, depending on what exactly you put in and how much sugar you put in. But I'll come back to that in just a second. The other thing that's important when you're sourcing your cider is to make sure that you get a cider that doesn't have a lot of potassium sorbate added. You'll still be able to ferment it if it does have potassium sorbate, but potassium sorbate is a chemical that inhibits the yeast digestion and metabolism process. It's done to keep it from fermenting on the store shelves. We'll do that at the end when we're ready to bottle our cider, but for now we want to make sure that we don't have potassium sorbate in our cider so that we get a nice fresh fermentation and our yeast can start eating sugar right away uninhibited. So, to sweeten our cider, you've got some different options. You can use pretty much any sugar source that's a natural sugar source. You don't want to use artificial sugars because yeast can't eat artificial sugars like stevia or things like that, though they come in handy for some other things. One of my personal favorite sugar sources is actually apple juice concentrate. Here I've got a nice frozen apple juice concentrate can, just a standard 12-ounce container of it, and this is basically apple juice with a lot of the water removed. Another way to do this, an old English traditional way to do this, is actually to freeze the cider and then use just the first half of the juice that thaws out. We're going to cheat a little bit and use this today. Other really common options are brown sugar or honey. You can also use just regular white table sugar, and it'll all work just fine. But today, we're going to use 1 container of frozen apple juice concentrate. You could also use 1 pound of honey or 1 pound of brown sugar, and all of those are going to put you right around that 5.5–6% alcohol and give you a medium sweet cider. It's going to be pretty similar to a lot of the ciders that you buy in the store. If you want something a little drier, you can either let it ferment a little bit longer, or you can use a little bit less of one of these added sweeteners. And that's the kind of thing that you'll experiment with as you do different batches. That's one of the reasons I encourage all people starting out brewing to start with 1-gallon batches. Your total cost here is only going to be about $10 worth of material. So it's not a huge loss if you mess up a batch or decide it's too sweet and that you don't really like it. Let me have a moment here. So I'm just going to pop this open. You'll see I've got a funnel sticking out of the top of my 1-gallon container, and literally all I'm going to do, I recommend letting this thaw out if you're buying it frozen first so that it pours nice and easy. It's also good to have all of your ingredients at or near room temperature because it helps the yeast along. It's okay if they're colder, they'll warm yeast will get started when it warms up. You don't want it hotter, because you might accidentally kill your yeast. So we've poured that in, and it's going along just fine. Then we're going to come back. So I don't know if you can see it on the video, but you can see our yeast here has started to grow some bubbles. You can see that little foamy bit at the top. And so our second ingredient is to dump that in. So that goes in. One thing you'll see is that there's a fair amount of yeast that sticks to the bottom. Because this yeast thing is a pretty scientific measured thing, one of the things we want to do is make sure we don't leave a ton of that yeast in the bottom of our pitching container. So what I do is just take the cider, pour it in there, stir it up an extra couple of times, and just do this 2 or 3 times until I make sure I've got pretty much all the yeast out, depending on how much it's sticking to the bottom and what have you. It doesn't have to be perfect, but it just helps to get all the yeast out of there. And what we're going to do is we're going to almost top this up. Topping up is a process that you're going to do because some of this is going to evaporate throughout the course of fermentation. And topping up means that you're reducing headspace. Headspace is the amount of air that's at the top of your fermentation vessel. So when the yeast first starts, you want it to have a lot of oxygen because you want it to be able to reproduce very readily and, get up to volume. So we're even going to shake this up when we get to a certain point. But once it's going, you actually want to keep it away from oxygen so that that yeast produces ethanol, which is obviously what we like to drink, as its byproduct instead of CO2, and reproducing, which is what it would do if there were an oxygen-rich environment. So now that I've gotten pretty much all the yeast out of that glass, I'm going to pour this in. I'm going to pour it nice and foamy because we want to get lots of oxygen into here. And I'm going to fill this up to pretty much where it says 1 gallon on here. We're going to put the cap on. We're going to give it a big old shake. Got my cap in the sanitizing solution over here. Everything, even your caps go in the sanitizing solution. Caps are the cause of more contaminated fermentations than I can tell you. We're just going to shake this up for a minute or two. It's not real scientific at this point, but like I said, you want to get as much oxygen into that mixture as you can. Take the cap off a couple of times so that more oxygen comes down in. And just keep shaking it up until you're reasonably satisfied that you've got quite a bit of oxygen in the mix. Now at this point, we've also got an opportunity to add some other flavorings. Today, I'm going to do a nice traditional straight apple-heavy cider, but you can also add some different flavorings. Common ones are things like mulling spices, or you can do like a cinnamon nutmeg clove mix. Other people will do things like add a little bit of another kind of juice, pineapple or orange. Experiment to your heart's content. This is your opportunity to really make your cider your own. So you can try a lot of different stuff here, and I highly recommend experimenting with it. Another thing you can do at this point is add something called pectic enzyme. Pectic enzyme comes in 2 kinds, the liquid kind or the powdered kind. They're pretty much the same thing, just the liquid kind already has the water added to it for you. And what that does is it forms a bond with all the little tiny microscopic particles of apple that are still in here, and it'll drag them to the bottom. This helps us get a nice, clear, sparkling cider instead of that darker, more English-style, opaque cider. So what I'm going to do is, the instructions are always printed on all of these little containers. This is another entirely optional chemical that you can get either online or from your local homebrew store. This one happens to say about 5 drops per gallon. And you can do this at any point in the fermentation. I like to do it right away because my personal philosophy is that the pectins, which are those little microscopic apple bits sitting in here, affects the flavor because they actually will start to rot in here a little bit in those first couple of days until the alcohol really starts to build up. So just as a flavor technique, I like to start pulling that pectin down to the bottom right away.
Do you find that there's much difference between the liquid and the powder?
In terms of function, no. The powder is definitely cheaper. And so, like this one here, this little half baggie was $1 at the homebrew store locally. And it's half a teaspoon per gallon, so you use a pretty small amount of it. So like this would probably last, even at the volumes that I brew at, this is probably 30 or 40 gallons worth of brewing. So it's pretty cheap to deal with, and it works just fine in the powdered form. The only thing with the powdered form is you want to make sure that you dissolve it in a little liquid before you put it in to your mixture. That way you don't wind up with little chunks, or, you know, just like when you're adding cornstarch to a recipe. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to add 5 drops of my liquid pectic enzyme here. I'm going to shake that up a little bit more. And I'm, like I said, not going to add any herbs or spices to this one, but by all means, leave yourself enough headspace to add whatever else you desire and let it ferment away. Hands are getting wet. This is a no-no. That jar opener is not sanitized. All right. Moving on. So now we've basically got what we need, and I'm actually going to top that up just a little bit more. Here. Now, I'm giving you these measurements based on experience, that I know that one of those cans of apple juice concentrate or 1 pound of sugar per gallon is going to get us into the sweet spot in terms of alcohol content and sweetness.
Dave, not to interrupt you, but there's a question here in the text that says, how much would you generally add in the spices?
So that, again, is a little bit of a discretionary thing. Very similar to the amount that you would add if you were making like a hot mulled apple cider. So, for example, these mulling spices here recommend 3 to 4 tablespoons for 8 cups. There's 16 cups in a gallon. So I'm going to add, I like to go a little on the light side because I find that because it's in there for so long, it goes a little stronger, but not much. But on the order of about 6 to 8 tablespoons here of mulling spice. If you're doing the nutmeg, cinnamon, cloves combination, I go about 3 tablespoons of cinnamon and 1 of each of the others. And that's going to give me, you can go a little lighter on the cloves. The cloves are definitely the strongest out of the 3 when you're using ground ones. But the flavor profile that I like, I do 3, 1, and 1. But you can, again, experiment a little bit with that and adjust it to your heart's content until you find where you quite like it. Everybody likes it a little bit different, but that's about about the amount that I like to use. So, here we much have cider. The last thing we really need to do is add an airlock, and we're good. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about a couple of other variants here, and a couple of other things we can do with it. So this is an airlock. Airlocks are pretty standard. You can buy these online for $1 at your local homebrew store. The other alternative, if you don't want to buy an airlock and be really absolutely super cheap, is to actually just go and take a couple of coffee filters. Cider's a very fast fermentation, and it's pretty acidic to begin with. Apple juice is pretty acidic, so it's a pretty safe environment. And especially when you're doing a smaller batch like this, if you don't have a space where this can overflow a little bit, you might want to start your first day or 2 with a pair of coffee filters and a rubber band over the top. And that will this is going to bubble and foam up as it ferments. That will let that little bit of foam come out without making a mess out of your airlock. I've got sanitizing solution going frequently enough that it's not a big deal for me, so I just use these. But you're just going to slide it in there, and usually with a gallon batch like this, within about 20 minutes, you'll start to see little bubbles popping up in the airlock up here. But before we get to that, I want to talk about a little bit more about what's going to happen during fermentation and what will happen. And what else you can do to adjust before. So 2 other little things. This is another little tool that as you get into it, this is one of the first specialized pieces of equipment I recommend everybody buys. It's a hydrometer.
Yes. Go tell Molly I said it's time to get ready for bed. Tell her, come here.
Take a little graduated cylinder that comes with the hydrometer. You fill it with your juice and you balance this in there. And you can read, I don't know if you'll be able to see it. Let me try and hold it up close. Basically, there's a scale on the side of these that you read. And it comes with a little chart that says, if your number is this is about how much alcohol you'll wind up with at the end. So that's the first piece of equipment I recommend if you get into this and really want to start experimenting with different juices or a significant amount of maybe orange juice or something like that, to make sure you've got enough sugar in there to get it to the alcohol content that you want. Does that make sense? All right, seeing some nods. And then the other ones are just little pH strips. Again, as you get more and more into this, pH strips start to come in handy. But yeast likes a fairly acidic pH, ideally between about 2.6 to 2.9 on the pH scale. It's plenty safe up to around 4.5, 4.6. Nothing bad's really going to grow. Apple juice is pretty safe because right on its own, it comes in right around the 2.5 to 3 mark, depending on the batch and the pressing and what have you and where you're getting it from. So you're in pretty good shape right from go there. And then we've added apple juice concentrate, which makes it even more acidic. So we're all ready. Actually, I'm going to dip one of these in and find out exactly where we are. So you'll see these guys have this little colored band on them. You dip it into your solution, and then it changes color. I'm not sure if you guys can quite see the color change, but it's lightened up a fair bit, and this one happens to be coming in at about 3.2, which is about where we want it. So it's pretty safe. This is going to be a fairly sweet cider based on that reading, but that's all right. So now we're going to get into the part where we need a little bit of imagination to follow along, but Caradoc's been sitting in here for a while and it's been bubbling away. Eventually it's going to stop bubbling again. You're going to reach a point where your bubbles go below 1 every 10 to 15 seconds. This is where a little bit of judgment comes in, and I'll show you how to judge it in a minute.
Dave, you have another question. It says, at what range is it not safe?
Above 4.6, you start to get concerned, but there are a couple of ways to deal with that. And again, safety is kind of a relative thing here. Like I said,
my microphone is off and they can't see you.
No,
thank you. You go eat it.
Brew something that was going to do more than give you a small stomach ache. Actually, brewing
Good night,
something
baby. I love you too.
is impossible.
No, I'm going to fix him tonight.
If you manage to
I'll come in and give you a hug in a minute, Molly.
Something that actually makes you sick, let me know, because I need to send that into the science lab, because my science professor told me that you couldn't do it. And if there's anybody I trust, it's that guy. Yes. So we're going to imagine that this has been brewing along for a little while, and our bubbles have started to decrease. Once our bubble rate goes below 1 every 15 or 20 seconds, we know that our yeast is starting to peter out. That means we need to check it. So, how do we check it? You're going to take this other specialized piece of equipment, or a straw, and you're literally going to do a taste test. That's the most effective way. By the time those bubbles have stopped, this has become acidic enough that we don't need to be quite so obsessive-compulsive about sterilization at this point. But we're just going to take this straw, we're going to dip it in, and we're literally going to taste it. It's going to be a little sharp because it hasn't aged yet, but you want to taste it and make sure it's starting to taste like cider. It should taste pretty sharp and alcoholic at this point. And at this point, you can drink it as is. If you like that flavor, go ahead and knock it back. It's absolutely good to go. But if you want to get into something that ages just a little bit and starts to have a little bit nicer, more mature flavor, you can do a couple of things. You can do what's called racking your cider. And you can buy, again, another specialized piece of equipment called a racking cane that's a little auto-siphon tool that lets you pump the cider from one vessel into the other. Or you top and leave that cake in the bottom. It's not a hugely scientific process. Nothing bad is going to happen if you get some of the sediment into the other container. And you can do this 2 or 3 times every day or two until it gets nice and clear and doesn't have a lot of that settled on the bottom. Or, like I said, if you don't care as much or like your cider opaque or a little chewier with some pulp in it, you can start drinking it as is. Once this is pretty well stopped or has slowed down, you have a choice to make. If you like the amount of sweetness that your cider has, go ahead and either put it in the fridge or add something to stop the fermentation. I use something called Camden tablets. That's that potassium sorbate in a tablet form that you can crush up, add to just a little bit of water, and dump in here.
Dave, you had a question. It says,
Sure.
what do you think about using champagne yeast?
So I actually like champagne yeast. The other one I use is called EC1118, is a champagne yeast. Yeah, a second. And it's cool because you can get a much stronger cider. You'll technically probably get into what's called apple wine territory, which is a distinction nobody except for vintners really cares too much about.
And New Yorkers.
Yeah, for sure. But there's nothing wrong with it. Like I said, you can even use baker's yeast if you like. Champagne yeast is going to give you a much lighter, crisper kind of taste. If you want to try an interesting combination, try that apple juice concentrate and the apple cider with pectic enzyme and champagne yeast, and you should be able to get a really nice, light-colored, crisp, sparkling cider, especially if you can find like a Granny Smith cider or something like that. Those can be really a lot of fun and a really nice cider to do. But typically, I like English ale yeasts, or that D47 Lavalin is probably the single most common in the homebrew world. Another alternative that's just starting to become really popular are called Saison yeasts. If you've ever heard of those, again, you can find them. It's a type of beer yeast. And those give you a slightly meatier flavor that's kind of interesting, and I kind of like. But yeah, so once you've gotten it to where you like the amount of sweetness that's in, if it's too sweet when you taste it that first time, rack it if you want, but let it sit for another couple of weeks. It's going to finish that, we call it the primary fermentation with lots of bubbles, inside of 2 weeks. Sometimes, if it's warmer, inside of 1 week. I've finished fermentations on a 1 gallon batch with a type of American ale yeast that's really like superpowered inside of 5 days. It doesn't taste great to drink when you do it that way. Low and slow is definitely the way to go if you want a really quality, nice, smooth tasting cider. But if you're in a rush, there's nothing wrong with using something like an American ale yeast and speeding through it, especially if you're going to let it bottle age for a while. So we let this sit for a while. We like the amount of sweetness that's still remaining in it. You know, we'll let it ferment all the way to maybe something semi-dry. Whatever you happen to like. Remember, you're drinking this unless you're entering this in a Dragon Master somewhere. So it's all about what you decide you like. If you are entering this in a Dragon Master, I highly recommend that you ask at least 6 weeks in advance who the judges are and how they like their cider, and tailor it to their preferences. It's a good way to score a couple extra points, but that's neither here nor there. We're then going to take them and we're going to bottle it. Bottling it doesn't have to be a big deal. Again, you're going to want to sanitize all of your equipment, and if you've gone out and bought one, you can use that racking cane again, or you can just use a little funnel. And I like to use flip-top bottles when I've got them, because they're cheap and they're reusable and they're really easy to cap. You just flip the thing over and close it. You can use either a capper or a corker, which are, again, specialized optional pieces of equipment as you get more into this, and want to cap or cork them just like the ones you get from the store, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with the flip tops, and they're pretty cheap and easy to use, and they'll last a really long time without a lot of maintenance. So you're just going to sterilize those, pour into here, cap, and set away. When you bottle is your opportunity to carbonate. As you know, excuse me, I'm going to grab a quick glass of water here. Not all ciders are carbonated. Some ciders are still. If you want a still cider, let this go all the way until it stops bubbling. It'll be fairly dry, and then you can either back sweeten it with one of those artificial sweeteners like stevia or something like that that the yeast won't eat. Or you can just bottle it right as is if you want it nice and dry. Alternatively, if you want a carbonated cider, you've got a couple different ways to go about that. And this is where you got to be a little careful because we run the risk of something called bottle bombs, and those are not fun. So, the easiest and, in my opinion, most foolproof way to do this is to use something called a carbonation drop. These are pretty much little hard candies, and actually you can use hard candies too. They'll affect your flavor, but if you get a natural, real sugar hard candy, there's nothing wrong with dropping one of those in too. And yeah, these are literally just little measured amounts of sugar, and they recommend 1 per beer bottle, 2 per wine bottle size, and I just eat these things as hard candy sometimes if I don't have one around. So we're going to add 1 to each of the regular size bottles, or 2 to a wine bottle, cap it, and let it sit. It'll take about a week to maybe 2 weeks. It'll take longer if you've got a drier cider. For it to digest that extra sugar that you've added in, it'll create CO2. But unlike letting it out through the airlock because it's capped, the CO2 is going to build up and dissolve into our cider. The problem here is that we run into a risk of something called a bottle bomb. The bottle is going to build up pressure. And this is one of the reasons I really like these flip tops, is because all of these flip tops, if they're decent flip tops from like a brewing store or something like that, and not like a cheap one from Walmart, is built to hold a fair amount of pressure. They've got things like a slightly concave bottom, an extra heavy glass seam, as well as a nice rubberized seal on the lid. All of these things work together to prevent overcarbonation and explosions. Explosions are bad, obviously, so if you do decide to do something like natural carbonation, which would be where you add about 1/8 of a teaspoon of any of your other natural sweeteners like brown sugar or something like that back to the bottle, then you run the risk of exploding if you're not real careful there. Does that make sense to everybody?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Alright. So now we've bottled our cider, and we're going to let this sit. Now, once this is finished fermenting, you don't have to bottle right away. You can let it sit in here for at least 6 months, sometimes longer if you've done a good job with sanitization before you have to worry about anything. I like to bottle fairly soon just because it's easier to store a closed, sealed bottle than it is something with an airlock on top. But this flavor is going to continue to age and is going to continue to change for at least a year after you've bottled it. So it's almost kind of fun to start a batch and then, have one and say, oh, that's pretty good, and then try another one a week later or 2 months later and see how they're doing. Obviously, they don't always last that long in the kitchen, but when you do bigger